Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our ICIT virtual briefing, Securing Automation for Mission Readiness. I'm Catherine McIver. I am the content manager for ICIT, and I am very excited to have you here to hear from Tony Salgado. He is our Senior Solutions Architect with Beyond Trust. Chris Blakely, Program Manager with NASA, and John Walden, a gentleman who needs no introduction, and I'll let him start the conversation by introducing himself.
Well, thank you for having us here today. Obviously, this is, we've had a few technical difficulties, and we'll hopefully get Joyce on here in not too long of a distance. But my name is John Walden. I am the Chief Technology Officer for Blue Prism. You know, everybody's read the abstract. This is really about focusing on intelligent automation and RPA, and really trying to help each of you attendees on the journey forward in that element. Quick question, since we don't have Joyce, do you want me to start sort of getting into the content, or do you want us each to go through and introduce ourselves a little bit more?
If you will give a really quick introduction, our panelists will give a really quick introduction, John, we will circle back on you because I'm going to direct the first question your way.
Not a problem. Chris, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself next then.
Sure. So I'm Chris Blakely. I work with NASA, and I'm the program manager for the NASA Enterprise Automation Service Office. Back in 2018 or so, that's when we started building automations. I wasn't in this role at that time, but that was when things were just new. We were trying things out for the first time and realized that it kind of spawned a bunch of automations that needed to kind of be wrangled in. So an office was set up, and that's the office that I currently run.
And Tony?
All right, and I am Tony Salgado. I'm a solutions architect at Beyond Trust, and with Beyond Trust for over 13 years. And really my role with the company is to help educate our customers in the importance of Beyond Trust and its many roles of security and IT.
All right, thank you. The main outcomes that we want to have from this session, and the reason we have these particular individuals with us here today, is it's really a question of, as you begin to look at RPA, intelligent automation as a whole, especially in the government space, the idea of centralizing the management capabilities of it, things like passwords, token, NPEs, these are all things that are, I'll call it a unique challenge. I deal with a lot of different organizations, but we want to make sure that you guys get the information that is necessary to really help you understand how to do it moving forward. And the main purpose of that is really to help you understand how to maximize the IT investments that are made, the systems of record, while continuing to use intelligent automation and RPA within the bounds of your organizations. You know, Beyond Trust here, especially from the perspective of making sure that every one of these projects is secured and capable, is a critical moment. And then it's really about balancing the ability and necessary to accomplish work with that idea of identity security and then the automation capabilities of either and intelligent automation or RPA.
Wonderful, John. Thank you so much for that. And that is a great segue into our first question. Do you mind clarifying for us, what is RPA and how does this differ from traditional automation?
Yeah, I would love to do that. So it's interesting because in the end, I always prefer to think about work accomplishments as being the main thing that we want to try and do. Unfortunately, when you talk about traditional automation, many folks think of the classic IT-centric focus, you know, coming up with new systems, long time frames to do development and everything of that sort. RPA introduced into the market probably, you know, Blue Prism's been around for 20 years. Some of the other vendors have recently gone public. All sorts of other capabilities are coming out on a daily basis. But the really key differentiator here between traditional automation and these newer intelligent automation RPA focuses is really it's who the audience is. Where traditional is IT, the business and the people who are closest to the work is really who the market is and who the focus is for RPA. You know, very often when you're dealing with traditional automation, you're dealing with many months of integration of back-end systems, a lot of coding and those types of capabilities. When you're looking at RPA, you are about enabling a business user to be able to diagram their process flow in some way, shape, or form, and then really allow that to be able to be run, usually on a virtual machine, very much similar to the way a person would. If you think about what the capabilities are, so often right now, until a project has hit that level of pain that traditional automation and IT is going to do something about it, humans pretend or act as middleware between different systems of record. That place where humans are acting as middleware is really where RPA sits and focuses. And the differences, when you look at not just the differences of the term, but the way it works is traditional RPA or traditional automation is very much code centric. That's why it has to be done by IT. When you're looking at RPA, generally you're using the regular interfaces that systems of record already provide, whether it's something like an SAP, whether it's something like a website, whether it's something even like Excel or Word or anything of that sort. And then the digital worker or the robot is interacting with those systems just as a person would, moving either information or gathering information between that, and then doing the appropriate process or workflow that needs to be done in order for that work accomplishment to occur. That's the biggest differences.
Excellent, thank you. And Chris, since NASA has such an established program, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask what advantages can be gained from implementing RPA?
Yeah, so to go into RPA a little bit, a lot of times what you'll see most of the demos and things that people will kind of focus on are the repeatable processes that are out there in the agency. And generally, those are going to be more of the business side. You'll see things like PR processing or creating travel vouchers, whatever. There's a lot of things out there that are done manually. They're repeatable. There's not a lot of decisions being made within flow, and so they're using those as primary points of contact to go in and automate away. So the idea is that generally you're trying to look for those things that are going to affect as many people as possible, as many hours saved as possible, and take those as the primary focus. But one of the big things that are happening that's starting to come out these days is the fact that traditionally you did look for the sort of dumb automations, things that you could just run through these processes, take the work out of the person's hands from having to go and do these and fat finger and making mistakes and things like that to save costs and open up some time for these folks. And then starting to bring in some of the newer technologies like machine learning and AI, which is where you get sort of intelligent automation, where you can take a receipt, for instance, and you can read the receipt and use OCR to pull the information off and actually do things that a person wouldn't have been able to do previously. So those are the things that we're now really focused on bringing to the agency, on trying to take sort of dumb automations and put some intelligence behind them so that we can expand the breadth of what we can automate away.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And I appreciate the clarification between dumb automation and moving forward, because I know that that's something that everyone has been thinking about is when do we start integrating AI?
If I can,
oh, go ahead, please. Yes.
If I can interject here, because I think it's we talk about dumb automation. First of all, whether you're doing traditional automation or RPA, automation is always a really good thing because generally it's going to help you either with the quantity of work, the quality of work, or resourcing constraints that you might have. The thing that starting with those basic projects is so critical of is it helps you. I mean, Chris has said he's been involved with this since 2018, and he's part of what they call their office. That's a really critical element because there is a lot to be learned, bruises to be had, for lack of a better term, hurdles to overcome within the bounds of every agency. And starting with those processes is definitely the low-hanging fruit. The other neat thing here about RPA in general is when you begin to talk about the idea of intelligent automation and the applying things like ML, AI, OCR, having those automations in place means that you've done some sort of analysis of what needs to be done. Once you've done that, then you can actually recognize within the bounds of your workflow, in order to accomplish what you need to do, where can you add those technologies on? So it's not just a matter of saying, okay, I want to play with AI or ML. It's a matter of recognizing AI, ML, OCR can contribute to allowing this digital worker to be able to do more. And so it becomes a great enabler as well as you look at these newer technologies that are being put forth as you go on in RPA.
Wonderful, thank you. That's actually a great segue into my question for all of you, but I'd like to start with Tony. Where is the best starting place for an organization integrating RPA into their existing infrastructure?
Yeah, so there's from an integration perspective, the key element where Beyond Trust comes in here are the privileged credentials and secrets. RPA typically need to consume these secrets, and this is where the Beyond Trust platform comes in. Now, many of our customers essentially centrally manage and monitor privileged secrets. Now, even if RPA have an available RPA credential store, for example, bringing those secrets into a centrally managed solution that spans all privileges and often is a question of compliance and how do you typically improve your risk posture. So by allowing these secrets to be rotated and managed, this typically mitigates that risk. And we've kind of partnered with Blue Prism to provide our common customers with an easy to use integration that they can quickly deploy and consume those privileged secrets within various automated processes.
Wonderful. Now, let me follow up on that for the other gentlemen to consider in their answers. What also should leaders understand when we're thinking about this implementation from a systems perspective? Now, gentlemen, thank you.
Yeah, I can speak from sort of my experience. One of the things that we've found is scalability is tricky with RPA. So you've heard there's sort of two flavors of RPA. There's the managed or the attended and unattended. Attended is not such a big deal because the person's sort of running it on their own desktop as they would in their normal day-to-day life for the most part. It's the unattended that tends to be tricky to manage because that's being run on a bot that's sitting somewhere else, like whether it's an on-prem VM or it's in the cloud someplace. And you have to schedule those at certain times. You have to have them on demand at certain times, depending on the customer that you're trying to build these for. And they can do different things. So the other thing is that they break all the time. So you need to have an ability to have a sort of an O&M office to be able to handle the scale that grows as these automations go into the wild, and to be able to have a quick turnaround time to repair anything that breaks. So if you're not familiar with these in the past, generally the biggest thing that breaks is when something's touching a UI that has an upgrade or something has changed within the flow that the RPA is normally looking for something specific. When that breaks, it just doesn't work anymore. And so you have to have someone ready to go to fix these things. You may have 1,000 people using them. So the turnaround time is really key, and having an office that's sort of centered around O&M is really important. So it's one of the things that's often overlooked when they do it. They just want to create automation as fast as possible, but they forget that I'm going to be running these things for years, so I need to actually have people watching them and have basically an SLA to turn it around as fast as possible. So that's one thing to consider.
Yeah, if I can add to that as well, there is a lot of difference between attended and unattended. The ability to think in terms of how automations are put together, which is why you have a center like that Chris belongs to, is perhaps a little bit different mindset than if you're just doing recording. A lot of the competitors out there offer record functionalities, and that's going to end up creating things that are very, very brittle within the bounds of the macros that you end up recording from that perspective. When you begin to think in terms of these unattended or autonomous sort of functioning capabilities, you have to recognize that things like NPEs, and this is where Beyond Trust comes into critical, those non-person entities, the fact that there's going to be plenty of capabilities around governance with regards to audit and those types of things is a critical nature of the plan that you do. And so when you begin to talk about implementing these things, especially at scale, you do have to recognize that, it's not a matter of just running it and knowing that a person's going to be sitting there to provide or make corrections as is necessary, but it's important to recognize that every process, whether somebody's sitting there or it's running autonomously, sooner or later is probably going to hit, especially if you're using something like AI or ML. a point of a problem within the bounds of it, whether it's due to confidence factor being too low from an AI ML, whether it's a system change that ends up occurring across the board. And that's what you have to give a little bit of advanced consideration to when you begin to think about the bringing RPA into your organization as a whole. The work, the capabilities, the amount of tasks that can be done is a huge force multiplier. But some of that multiplication is going to have to be given back in order for the maintenance orientation and just recognition of that there will be some things that have to still be done by humans. It's not a matter of replacing the humans by any of these technologies. It's a matter about giving them time, their valuable time back.
Thank you so much, John. I would almost consider that you're a mind reader, because my next question was going to discuss governance plans versus implementation roadmaps. I know that we tend to get very excited about our solutions and we want to run right in, but with everything going on from a CISA and the executive order perspective, governance plans are starting to come to the forefront of our mind. So my question is how important is it to have a governance plan compared to with an implementation roadmap when we're initiating RPA processes?
Since I was just talking, I'll go ahead and lead off on this real quickly. And I was on a conversation earlier today, and we were talking about the famous Mike Tyson quote, and I'll probably massacre it a little bit. Everybody has a plan until they get that first punch in the face. From Blue Prism's perspective, because we've always been at that enterprise focus more than the attended desktop focus, governance has been critical. We from day one had a very robust, what we call a robotic operating model. I think having that in place allows you to not only prioritize, because once you begin this process, you're going to have a whole slew that are going to say, oh, me next, let me automate this, let me automate that. And you're going to have to figure out how you're going to appropriately scale, as Chris had just mentioned, but also how you're going to prioritize those. And so by having as much of that, or at least an inkling of how you're going to handle that stuff, which is what we call our robotic operating model, ahead of time, it is incredibly important.
Wonderful. Before I ask Tony and Chris to weigh in, do you mind telling me a little bit more about this robotic operating model?
Yeah, so the robotic operating model takes into consideration that, a lot of people say, okay, we want to automate this. And it doesn't necessarily have a number of categories. It doesn't have things like, what's your vision for this? What is your KPIs? One of the critical items overall is, how are you going to measure success? It's one thing to automate something, but as Chris had mentioned before, let's say you automate it on the desktop and all of a sudden you've moved it into autonomous and now you've got to have somebody managing that thing 24/7. You're not getting the value out of it. So it's looking at things, everything from vision, orientation of returns and values and expectation. It's a matter of understanding the implementation orientation, because a lot of these things, especially with regards to Tony and his capabilities of security, the idea of NPEs is something that's still causing a lot of agencies a lot of difficulty. So you've got to make sure you know how you're going to overcome those hurdles. But it's probably more than anything, making sure that you've got that executive sponsorship to really help clear these roadways across the board. There are, as you said, a lot of changes happening with regards to plans, with regards to agencies having specific missions that they've been assigned to do it. And if you can get that bought in up high, it definitely is a lot easier as you begin to look at the specifics of doing the implementation as you get down below.
Wonderful, thank you. Tony and Chris, same question about governance versus implementation roadmap.
Chris, why don't you fire away?
Yeah, I mean, given that I work at a federal agency, governance is pretty much every single day I have to deal with that. And they get pretty granular, but I try my best to focus on the things that are going to matter for the office. So the governance from the development meaning developing the automation, putting it out on the platform and then running it, that's actually pretty straightforward. What I found to be the linchpin in the process is really dealing with the customer up front. And what you find is that the process that the customer wants to automate is often not the process you actually automate at the end, because they think that they know exactly what they want automated. You realize when you sit in a room with them that there are 10 steps you could cut out, or there's another process involved, or oftentimes they'll create more work for someone else down the line. They just want to get their stuff out of the way. So what's been very important to us is on the governance side is to understand the process from A to Z all the way across the board. So we know what's happening before the person gets to the automation process and what happens after whatever we're automating goes into production. And we've found many times that there are customers before them and there are customers after them that could also benefit from slight deviations from the automation so that we can incorporate as many people as possible and as many hours saved. So that requires in-depth knowledge of what they're doing, and it requires a process team to go and sit with the customer to make sure that it's very clear what it is that they want, so that that process team can essentially write the requirements, write the stories to deliver to the developer in sprints, so that they can go ahead and develop how many sprints they need to get this automation off and running. And what often happens during that handoff is that the customer goes back to their job and says, call me in 2 months when this thing's ready to go, and I'll be ready to automate everything that I've just told you about. But that obviously doesn't work. You have to have them involved in the process the entire time as you're developing this. And so that's been one of the things that's been tough with some of these customers that are not familiar with development processes, to get them in every 2 weeks to see a demo of what they're at, to make sure that they've weighed in on any changes that have come up or any problems we've run into, so that they basically have a stake in the game all the way through the end. And so that's what we're doing now. It's something that wasn't being done at the beginning, but it is something that it doesn't get enough attention, but you'll find very quickly that if you don't spend that time with the customer up front, what you develop or deliver may not be used as widely as you could have had it spin out. So.
All right. Well, in the context of privileged access, so when I think about governance, it's really thinking about same thing like what Chris said, right? It's all about the visibility of those privileged access, privileged credentials, privileged secrets. So you want to be able to kind of identify what are these business processes, these RPA processes that are running, that are going into Beyond Trust, getting those secrets, and understanding where they're coming from. What is the life cycle of that particular identity? Are they being rotated when we use them, and then when we bring them back to Beyond Trust? And then also the life cycle, right? Whether that business process is finished, right? Do we need to then sort of decommission that identity? And also from a reporting perspective, what is the velocity? What is the volume that these different processes are using? And that's really important from a privileged secrets are concerned.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I actually want to circle back on something that Chris had mentioned. So you mentioned sprints and you mentioned 2-week cycles. It sounds like you guys use an agile project management approach to implementing RPA. Are there any other ways that this could be approached, or what are the considerations between a waterfall and an agile approach that we should keep in mind as we're starting?
Yeah, so the biggest difference I'd say between most development projects is that automation projects they don't have huge teams of developers. You're talking 1, maybe 2 people working on an automation at a time, in addition to the SMEs and the process team and all that sort of thing. But in other development projects I've been in the past, usually you'd have 4 or 5, 6 developers, so it gets a little bit trickier with those sprints. So what we found is that the sprint methodology is good more for the customer than it is for our developers. It has more to do with just making sure that the customer is well aware of what the requirements are for each sprint period and what they're delivering within that time frame, so that when we go to the demo point, they know exactly what they're going to see, and they're going to check off each one of those stories to say, yeah, I see that you've incorporated that aspect of the process. And so we're basically forcing them to make sure they're included in the process. Because again, one of the biggest headaches we've had in the past is we would go off and start building these things and they wouldn't come along for the ride. And so when it came to pushing it out, either a couple people would use it or just didn't have the full process that they had initially thought that they were getting, and they were finding that out way too late. So to save costs, to prevent rework, this agile development has been a lot faster and a lot less of a headache for us to implement.
Wonderful, thank you. John, I see you nodding your head. Do you have any insights on development cycles?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said before, this is the difference between traditional IT automation and RPA, is that involvement of the SME. I think the other thing that a lot of organizations, and I think Chris sort of touched on it, but maybe wasn't real direct, is that I mentioned before that you're using people as human middleware. If you can even take part of what they're doing and assign it to a digital worker, you're going to end up being able to get through a whole lot more work and have a whole lot better quality at it. So often in traditional IT, when we talk about doing a process by the classic waterfall, you're going to do everything from A to Z, and then maybe a couple of extra letters as well. With RPA, because you are doing it agilely, you may just do A, B, and C, and that may be enough to do a good majority of the work and then hand it back. I've been doing this with Blue Prism for about 7 years now from that perspective. A while back, I started talking a lot about I call the unified workforce. When we think about development in general, we have to first understand what our business purpose is, then figure out what the workflows and the governance needs are, and then finally think about the resourcing. And if you do that, you can take any task, break it down, and decide, okay, we can assign this to a human, then it needs to go to a digital worker to do aggregation, data verification, whatever the case may be, then it may need to go back to a human. But it's really a matter of understanding who's the best resource to do the work. And it's funny because when we're dealing with humans, we have no problems with understanding this. If you're dealing in the accounting area, doing something of that sort, you'll know this needs to go through these 3 people who are junior. That would possibly go to these people. And we often use everything from BPM tools to emails, whatever the case may be. Because a digital worker is doing this just like a human would, you don't necessarily have to modify that, but you can shift that worker, instead of shifting it to a human, shift it to a digital, and then really make that decision along each step of a larger process, how much needs to be done, what that low-hanging fruit is. And if you approach it from a very agile perspective, then you can pass it back and forth and really accomplish a lot more in a little bit of time.
Wonderful, thank you. Chris, I'm going to come back to you and pick on you a little bit because you had commented about working for a federal agency. So when we are thinking about considerations for cloud or on-prem infrastructure, what are some factors that we should keep in mind when we're looking at that?
Yeah, so the number one thing that generally throws a wrench in a lot of people's plans is just FedRAMP certification and going through the ATO process to onboard something else that they maybe are using today. I came from a cloud office. That's part of my background, was with the cloud architecture at NASA before I came over to RPA and intelligent automation. And so I had a pretty strong focus to move off of our on-prem instance into AWS in our case, and Azure. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but one of them is cost. One of the things that tends to happen with RPA is that depending on how you run your unattended automations, you can run it on a VM, which may consume hours. And depending on how you're running your infrastructure, those VMs may be spun up all over the place, and they may not shut down, or you may not have the code in place where you're really managing them effectively. So they can cost quite a bit a year to keep those going. With cloud infrastructure, it's a little bit more cost effective because you can spin them up and spin them down as the automation is needed. So depending on what it is, again, automations can be anything pretty much, but many of them can be spun up just for an hour and then turn it off, and you're not consuming costs at that point. And so what might have cost $6,000 a year to run in our normal on-prem environment will cost us a couple $100 a year. So those kinds of cost savings are a primary reason to go to the cloud. But we already had a lot of those ATOs in place. We have the cloud infrastructure in place. I helped do that in my old job. So I sort of set the foundational aspect. So it was much easier for us to consume those EC2s and things like that we need, where previously, if I had not had any experience in cloud, bringing that on would be a pretty heavy lift initially. So hopefully your agency has some environment that you can take advantage of. The other thing that it does is it opens up a little bit easier access to some of the cloud native ML, AI, there's lots of different things that they can bring to the table that you could then leverage because you're already in their environment. It doesn't have to be. You can go cross cloud and pull different environments as you need, but it does help. So one of the things that we've recently onboarded Office 365. So that is something that we've been using pretty heavily over the past 2 or 3 years at the agency. Microsoft's coming pretty heavy with their intelligence solutions as well. So they have their Power Virtual Agents, which are chatbots. They have their Power Automate, which is sort of their version of the automation tools. We started with UiPath as the vendor for our path to start, but now that there's so many other vendors out there that can do it, we want to bring in as many as possible to basically compete. You know, some are better at others, at automations than others. So we want to make sure that we can offer the best use case and the lowest cost to the people that are trying to automate these things away. So there are many reasons why you might use a Microsoft or a UiPath or anything out there, but it's just something to be aware of when you're setting these up, that try to focus on what's coming, not so much what it is today, because that's one of the things that is changing relatively quickly. As if you just focused on what RPA was a year ago, you'd be missing out on all the new things that are basically coming tomorrow. So just be aware of those things.
Wonderful. Tony, you've been quiet over there off on the side. How about you? Any considerations from a non-federal agency perspective for cloud versus on-prem infrastructure?
But really, in terms of privileged accounts, right? It's really agnostic to that. It's just your preference. Cloud infrastructure is really becoming, more of a direction whenever we talk to our customers, whether it is a sort of a mandate or whether it's cost reduction, as Chris had mentioned. From a privileged account, they all exist, whether we're in the cloud or we are on-prem. It doesn't really matter to us. It's just a matter of what are some of the capabilities within privileged identities that you want to take advantage of. For example, in AWS, there is a keys to the kingdom, if you will, when you're spinning up and spinning down what we call EC2 hosts or EC2 key pairs. It starts with what they call an IAM account. So this is think about this as when you enter your house, you've got that key. When you start your car, you have your key, although we press a button these days. But at the end of the day, we still need that key, right? And so from a privileged identity perspective, that is a target identity that we want to protect. And there is a concept of just in time within Beyond Trust, where you would only need to provision those accounts when you spin up an EC2 host, like Chris had mentioned, right? And then when you spin down, then essentially when you're, let's say, for example, you have an infrastructure as code that automates your spinning up or spinning down of your servers, for example, in the cloud, right? So you would need that identity, that IAM account, which is stored in the Beyond Trust secret store. And then once your infrastructure as code exits out, then the life cycle of that IAM also gets deleted. So that's kind of where we come in there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, Chris, since you mentioned bots earlier in your last answer, what's some of the ideas for best approach for bot authentication?
Yeah, so again, with the federal government, it can be a little bit tricky. I know at NASA, we have a PIV mandatory model where you have to use your card to log into many of the tools that we have available to us. And so having a card is generally tied to a person. You know, a person would have their credentials tied to that card. For a digital worker, you can get cards for these as well. It's a little bit trickier, and those accounts can be looked at a little bit suspiciously when you have a credentialing service like you were mentioning earlier. If you're going to sign up a bot to a service that you are not the service owner for or the system owner for, they can look at that bot and say, I don't want bots in my account for some reason. And so those are some of the governance that you have to work out to make sure that this account can come into some other service that needs to be automated. But authentication-wise, PIV can be a problem because you generally need to have a physical card in a machine that's physically somewhere that you lock down and you can't have anyone have access to other than the SA, and that can be something that can stop scalability. So if you have 100 bots, 100 digital worker IDs could be challenging to maintain and moderate. So what we've done is we've taken sort of the industry best practices, and we have a CA-PAM mixed with an HSM component to make sure that we can still, it's sort of like using ID password, but you're sending credentials across the wire and you're going into multiple places for sort of a two-factor authentication prior to getting this digital worker into a service without having to use the physical certificate on a PIV badge or a CAC card. So that's something that we're just implementing right now. It generally requires an HSM located somewhere. In our case, it's located on-prem, and then we have a CAPAM, which is a like a password manager kind of model that we have on-prem as well. So our AWS infrastructure talks to those places, rotates passwords every 24 hours, and then those passwords are then used for that day's work, and then it gets thrown away at the end of the day. So so that's essentially the model that we're working with, and that's been sort of the best practices that we found. If you can get it up and running, it's not the easiest thing to get started, but it is sort of what we've seen across the industry as the best practices.
Excellent. Thank you so much. John or Tony, any comments on bot authentication?
You know, Chris has summarized it really well. The idea of a non-person entity, I think the one thing that organizations that haven't started yet have going for them is NASA, you know, for Blue Prism's customers, whether it's the Joint Munitions Command or the Border Protection Agency, they've all done this at this point in time, so things are a lot easier. The most entertaining part when I have these conversations with entities and looking at particular missions is that so often when there are failures in technology, it's really not the security that fails, it's usually the people that fail in some way, shape, or form. You know, we years ago showed a CAC card being done with a digital worker to automate some work for a particular individual. And until you recognize that the idea of privilege is only one piece of it, the security, you can take a digital worker and probably secure it and have better audit than you will from a person perspective any day of the week. You know, if you're using something like Beyond Trust, you can limit it, you can secure it any number of ways, even within the bounds of our own platform, you can do it. There's so many ways that you can do the security, and the governance of having every single step when a digital worker is doing something available to you should be hugely enabling for most organizations. But getting past that mindset of this is not accounted to a particular individual is still the biggest thing that each agency has to continue to work toward and through a little bit.
Wonderful, thank you. And that is an excellent segue for my last question. So I would like to hear from all of you, but what recommendations do you have to balance RPA, identity, and security priorities?
I can kind of talk from our point of view. You know, it is like what John was saying about it's a balance. I mean, you can put a bunch of locks on a credential all day long, but you know, the person that has an automated, you know, that has the badge, they can do pretty much whatever they want on their own. So it's not just about securing the bot identity, but it's also about setting up the governance so that you can talk to another system that is in your agency without having to go through a whole hoop of governance just to get in to automate away something that someone is doing every day anyway. That's some of the tricky parts about moving to an automation if you've never done them in the past. So people are generally skeptical about what you're trying to do, and they're worried that the bot will go rogue or whatever and start to do all these other things that it was never programmed to do. So those are some of the things you do have to get over. But what I've tried to do is focus on the infrastructure first, so to lay the foundation with cloud, lay the foundation with the authentication methods to build the trust with these system owners, so that then we can put the governance on top of how a digital worker should be or shouldn't be allowed to be used. We've centralized that point so that I am the central point at NASA for these things, so I don't have to worry about sort of a Wild West mentality where you might have someone doing something that doesn't meet security requirements, for instance, or using an unapproved cloud instance as an example. That is something that can be tricky, because you don't want RPA or intelligent automation to have a bad name because someone else not following the governance is out there doing it. You want to that's at least what we're doing. We're trying to centralize it so that we know that if it's coming out of this office, we're following all the standards, we're following all the security requirements, opposed to someone that wouldn't have followed it. That's why if you're doing automation at NASA, you're going through the office that I'm running. So that's something to consider. But that is not the standard. I mean, lots of people do it differently. They have multiple offices that do different automations that do it completely different. We just chose to go more centralized route to try to make it easier on the system owners.
Wonderful. Tony or John?
Tony, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of Beyond Trust, and when I think about RPA, really, I look at Beyond Trust as sort of a central repository and is an external sort of credential store for RPA, right? So what this means is that you only give privileged accounts to your business processes, in this case with Blue Prism, whatever processes that are running, you only give that credential at runtime, right? So this essentially accomplishes least privilege and just in time. So to elaborate a little bit more on the least privilege, I kind of always think about least privilege in a context of a human in a sort of a non-human interaction, right? So we talked about automation, look at your privileged account and centralize that as an external store. But from a human interaction, it, believe it or not, it still applies. You know, Chris talked about it, John talked about it. At some point, when you want to fix something, a human would intervene, and there's an identity in there that you need to use. Least privilege just essentially allows you to control what specific applications you want to run at that time. If this is part of an automated script or tasks or a command line that you have to perform, right? So you only do that at that time. So when you need to log in, whether this is a Linux host, whether this is a Windows host, right? You log in at that least privileged level. 99% of that time can be accomplished. There are certain tasks that cannot accomplish least privilege. Then this is where you would essentially need to elevate your identity into a true administrator account. And this is where, again, Beyond Trust comes in, where you would check out that credential in a just-in-time manner, and then check it back in when you're done.
So from my perspective, from the Blue Prism perspective, I think the key element is, you said it in the question, that was balance. How do you balance RPA, identity, and security? And it really comes down to, I was talking just yesterday with a defense contractor, and they were kind enough to, they've been a customer for some time now. They basically put the value of their, let me get this straight, their yearly run rate value at 123 million for their digital workers. If you understand the value that anything is going to provide, it makes the adjusting the balances appropriately a lot easier. So this gets back to that whole ROM element. If you know what you're going to end up, what your business purpose is, if you know how you're going to measure what that's going to end up doing, it's going to allow you to figure out how we overcome hurdles that somebody may not be comfortable with identity or security aspects, who may be recognizing that with RPA, since the governance is there, maybe you can make some adjustments on the identity and security. It can be far more secure because of all the things that Tony with Beyond Trust just said. NASA has already proven this many times, as many other organizations within the bounds of it. And it's really a matter of, more than anything else, is recognizing the value and that you want to get started. And if you get started, even with low-hanging fruit that don't have the elements of high levels of identity and security needs, it's going to enable you to move things forward much more rapidly and really enable you to figure out where those hurdles are going to be, figure out how to balance them appropriately, because you certainly never want to, and with RPA, you would never need to jeopardize anything on identity, security, or governance in order to be able to advance accomplishing the work of whatever the mission is that you have, that you need to do. Hopefully that answers it sufficiently.
It does. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to slip in one last one because I'm very selfish and we want to hear from that. If I were to go to my senior leadership team and propose an RPA solution, John, you threw out a very sexy number about 123 million. What would be some good points for me to bring up to senior leadership team that this is a good direction for my organization to go?
I think the key element is really to understand, Chris has mentioned that they do it through a COE. We have other organizations who have done it a little bit more federated from that perspective. But if you understand what's driving your organization, what that business purpose is, what that mission is, then you can appropriately position it. As I mentioned before, when I first started in RPA, I recognized that there were really three primary drivers: quantity of work, quality of work, and resourcing. If you can put it in terms of the value that makes sense for your mission, for your business purpose, I think that's going to be where the conversation needs to start. It's not a matter of just cost savings. It's not a matter of within the federal government, it's a little bit different than the corporate world. It's not a matter of savings FTEs. That's a little bit of a misnomer that's been put out with the RPA early on. It's very similar to something Chris mentioned before. I was going to say, we don't have to worry about things like Skynet taking over and doing things that are not appropriate. RPA is very much a methodical approach to work accomplishment. And if you can identify and help senior management, every part of your organization within the bounds of it's really about accomplishing that mission. And this is a way to do it more effectively, more efficiently, more precisely. Those are the things you really want to try and drive. Those are the things you want to look for and understand ahead of time and really incorporate in your message to your senior leadership.
Wonderful. Chris or Tony, any other thoughts? Because I'm taking notes so I can pitch this.
Yeah, I would say that John's right. I mean, generally, when we are talking about the value, we're talking about the hours saved from that person doing the work. So you're generally not, we're not ever talking about taking automation and taking that person's job and tossing it. That's generally not what we're talking about doing. We're taking that person's piece of their job and they don't have to do that monthly process anymore, or whatever it is that they were doing. Or maybe it's 1,000 people doing 10 minutes a day worth of work. You're taking that away from them. But down the road, if you're doing enough of this, you could not need as many people in the next contract or something like that down the road. So that's where the costs generally come in. It's not, I never propose things and say it's going to save us $1 million a year, because it's just not really reality for the government anyway. It's going to save this many minutes. It's going to save 35,000 hours, which is equivalent to FTEs, but really those FTEs are just doing something else, doing the things that they couldn't get to while they were doing those automations in the first place, or doing the manual work before the automations were in place. Another thing that it does, though, is it saves a lot of the mistakes. That's something that a lot of people don't really point to that often, but you're not having people fat finger numbers in incorrectly. You're not having PRs run through with incorrect information anymore, because the data is being automated, so it's being picked up from the source and being moved through the flow. That itself can be cost savings, along with just not having to involve all the people to fix the mistakes that had happened in the past. And so there's a number of those types of things. But what we tend to find is that a lot of things at NASA anyway are backlogged. So it's not that we don't have the people to do it. It's just that they're fully engaged, and we have a lot of work that needs to be done, whether it's Earth science data that's being pulled down from satellites, whether it's PRs that are written at the end of the year, whatever it is. There's a lot of backlog, and we don't have the resources to add more people. But this allows you to add more time to those people to go do that backlog work, and hopefully make their job a little bit more less stressful than it had been in the past. Because what we find is, this is a good position to be in, because when you deliver an automation, unlike some other positions you can be in, they're happy that they don't have to do that manual process anymore. They're glad that the thing that took them an hour to do in the past now takes 2 minutes of clicking, and then they don't have to think about it anymore. So that's a nice place to be. And so that's just one of the things that I would point to, is trying to save as much time as possible so that they can do the stuff that they're usually unable to get to.
And from a Beyond Trust perspective, it's really all about that identity, specifically privileged identities, right? So this automation, since it happens in the background, right? So it's like prog magic. It just, we don't know it's happened. It gets done. But at the end of the day, there are multiple processes that happen in the background and multiple touches in different applications, right? And this is where a privileged identity that you can externalize, that can handle all of these different processes and applications and interact with them easily. That's also important, particularly for governance, now that you can have visibility of those privileged identities.
Awesome. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And thank you so much for your time to come and discuss with us the importance of RPA when we're looking at securing our mission readiness. So in addition to thanking you for your time and insights, I would also like to thank our ICIT sponsors, Blue Prism and Beyond Trust, for supporting us in being able to offer this session for our constituents and audience. So thank you very much, gentlemen. I know we're looking forward to hearing from you guys again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Good to be here. Thank you.